Cathy Oddie is now a director at Violence Free Families, and she's worked across a number of sectors, from everything from Centrelink, superannuation, mental health, emergency service and family violence. Now, this cross-sector experience, as well as her own lived experience of family violence and sexual assault and mental health related matters, have given Cathy quite a unique insight into the many challenges faced by people experiencing complex life challenges and circumstances and trying to navigate the service system for assistance. Now, there's currently an inquiry into Victoria's criminal justice system, of which Cathy has submitted a couple of points, and we're here today to find out about those. Morning, Cathy.
Hi, Michael. Thanks very much for having me. Yes, so recently the Victorian Government has been having a range of hearings for their inquiry into Victoria's criminal justice system. So I decided that, based on a range of things that I've experienced, I'd really like to put in a submission, and I was actually then called to give evidence at one of the recent hearings. So I was really looking at focusing in with my submission on some things that had sort of been raised throughout some of the earlier consultations that I'd done throughout the last 12 months. So, for example, in terms of Victorian Law Reform Commission, they've had a couple of key inquiries. They've looked at, for example, the Improving the Justice System Response to Sexual Offences. That report has just finally been released. And also there's been an inquiry around stalking and harassment laws. So when I was part of the consultation processes for both of those, it gave me sort of pause to think about some things that I'd want to go into a bit more depth than what I had the opportunity to during those consultation processes. So basically my submission to this particular justice inquiry was to look at, for example, how I didn't have the opportunity because I hadn't got it in on time around something that we discussed last time I came on the Informer, which is around having the right for victim survivors of stranger rape to have the ability to know the identity of their offender if the police have actually established some key suspects. So this for me was an opportunity to get that in at a formal level with the government, to request that they look at reviewing that based on everything that that we discovered earlier this year as part of when I got the Victims of Crime Consultative Committee, Department of Justice Community Safety, looked at what those processes which currently prevent that. So that's one thing I was looking at as part of this submission. The other was also in relation to affirmative consent laws and how Victoria should follow on from New South Wales, and we can talk a bit more about that later. A key focus I had in this particular submission was around the absolute incredible need for the introduction of fit-for-purpose trauma recovery centres in every state of Australia, because currently we don't have anything that meets the needs of people who've suffered seriously violent crimes and are suffering from the after impacts of these things, such as depression, PTSD, anxiety. And when I say these, you have to think, oh, okay, there's psychiatric facilities. That's not what I'm talking about. It's a place that's actually made, which is got a range of different practitioners, that's holistic, that's in a beautiful setting where you're able to bring your dog, for example, and that it's the issue at the moment, there's nothing like that that's affordable, accessible. And then carrying on from like looking at the need for the role that animals play in healing and recovery from trauma, it was acknowledging the fact that right now in Victoria and probably most other states of Australia, that emotional assistance animals are not given any formal recognition around the role they play and in terms of the protections they can have legally or potential rebates that victim survivors might be able to get. So I was suggesting there that it would be great if people's existing pets that they already look towards for support through very difficult times. And I know for me personally, I wouldn't be alive today without the dogs that have helped me get through my journey. So I was seeing there was a couple of different options, like, for example, being able to be funded to have your dog trained up to the level where it's given the assistance animal label, where it gets then all the different rights of where that type of animal can go within the community. Or on the other hand, there'll be also other animals which won't be able, or not everyone needs an actual assistance animal to that category, but there will be a lot of people who will be, whether it's their cat, their dog, their horse, whatever it may be, that they'd be looking to, that gives them such a high level of support emotionally, to have some sort of formal recognition of that. So these are just a few of the things that I raised in my submission.
Yeah, it always confounds me that when we get service providers saying these victims aren't engaging with the service and somehow thinking it's the fault of the victims rather than the service not being fit for purpose, rather than trying to get around those hesitations that arise. And thankfully your wonderful advocacy will maybe do that. Now, this is great that it's into the criminal justice system, and as we said, it's clearly not meeting the needs of the victims. But as I said to you earlier, I don't even think it's meeting the expectations of the general population rather than just the victim survivors. It's just unbelievable that it's gone so long and been so flawed. How hopeful are you of a good outcome from this?
Look, I'm quite hopeful that meaningful change will come from this. I think that the different committee members who participated in these hearings, such as we've got Tanya Maxwell, Member of Parliament, and Fiona Patton were just two of the members of that committee. They really treated myself and the other victim representative from the Victims of Crime Consultative Committee very respectfully with our stories, and they showed a genuine interest in what we would want to see around change. And so in terms of going forward, I think if we see this recent report from the Victorian Law Reform Commission around sexual offences as an indicator of where we might be going in terms of how there's a shift in the way that government prioritises victim survivor needs over the rights of perpetrators, then I think that's the way we need to go, because currently what we have is not fit for purpose. It is failing the community in so many different ways. And even if you are not directly impacted as someone who's experienced being a victim of crime, what as a community you'd have as an expectation if you were to find yourself in, unfortunately, in these sort of situations, is that you would be expecting that you would have a much better response on all levels, from the initial police investigation right through to the different criminal justice outcomes and victim supports. So I think you can't just look at this from one angle, and I think this is what this Justice Inquiry is looking at, is it's looking at it from a range of different perspectives, from the key stakeholders working in the different parts of this justice ecosystem, but the fact that they're also prioritising hearing the voices of lived experience, I think is very key.
Now, we recently mentioned that New South Wales is just about to enshrine the affirmative consent laws. We're looking at it here, and we've seen Grace Tame very vocal in the need for a uniform federal framework around this. Is it frustrating to see it happen in one state and then have to be implemented in another state, when we can clearly see there are best practices in different areas, in different jurisdictions, but surely we should be able to get this together and make it a uniform one, even the point that you can be a family violence perpetrator in one state and go to another state and not be. How do we get past this? How do we get a collective action on this?
I couldn't agree with you more. I actually think the fact that when it comes to things such as child abuse, sexual violence, domestic abuse, these things shouldn't actually be laws that are on a state-by-state basis. They should be federal laws that it doesn't matter which jurisdiction you're in, you should be having an expectation of getting the same type of protection, assistance, support, regardless of which postcode you're in. It blows my mind that, for example, you can be protected by an intervention order, say here in Victoria, and then that you then make a choice to, say, move to New South Wales for whatever personal reasons you might have, particularly for safety, and then you have to apply for a whole new intervention order in that jurisdiction, when it would seem to me such an obvious thing to just be able to carry that over into that jurisdiction. And so ultimately, I think, as you said, Grace Tame's call to make these national offences or have standard nationalised processes, it needs to happen. It's really not meeting the needs of victim survivors. It also means that it increases the risk of perpetrators slipping through the net, and let's just say they might have been guilty of a crime in Victoria, and they go to Queensland. Depending on what the nature of what they've actually done, it may not even come up on a check there. Like, particularly in the cases of where someone hasn't had a guilty conviction recorded, if they're seen to be experiencing mental health issues whilst they've been perpetrating the crime. So that for me is a huge risk factor there. And so, but I guess if we focus on the one positive here, or there's actually a few positives, I think it's fantastic that New South Wales has introduced it. And I think in terms of affirmative consent, and the fact that people in Victoria will now also have to make sure that their sexual partners are consenting or risk committing a crime here under the proposed changes to the law. So the Attorney General, Jacqueline Symes, recently announced that the changes to the Crimes Act 1958 would specify a person must confirm they've received consent for sexual activity. And it also has stated that the government will amend laws to make it explicit that stealthing, which is the removal of a condom or other protection during sex without the other person's knowledge or consent, will also now be a crime. So these amendments will be looked to be introduced in 2022 and were part of those recommendations from the Victorian Law Reform Commission report. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful there. So these recommendations, as far as I'm concerned, are all about minimising harm, reducing risk of trauma, ultimately creating a safer community for us all.
Great. All right, Cathy Oddie from Violence Free Families, Director now. Thanks so much for your time and for your advocacy.
Thank you so much for having me today.